When 4 words from an Iranian foreign minister cause global oil prices to plunge and stock markets to surge within minutes, you are not watching diplomacy. You are watching power. And on April 17th, 2026, Iran just reminded the entire world exactly how much of it they still hold. Hello and welcome. I am Rick Orban, and you have started watching The Truth Global. In the span of a single afternoon on April 16th, 2026, something happened in the Middle East that most analysts had declared impossible. A ceasefire went into effect between Israel and Lebanon at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, brokered not through the United Nations, not through quiet European diplomacy, but through Washington. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had spent days facilitating the coordination, and within hours, Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically vital waterways on the planet, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil flows, completely open. Markets reacted immediately. Oil plunged. Stocks jumped. The world exhaled. But here's what the headlines are not telling you. This ceasefire is 10 days long. Hezbollah has not formally signed anything. Israeli troops remain on Lebanese soil inside a 10-kilometer security zone. And behind the scenes, Iran was not simply welcoming this deal. Iran was conditioning it. Tehran had made clear that a truce covering Lebanon was a prerequisite for allowing a second round of nuclear talks with the United States to proceed at all. What looks like a peace announcement is in reality the opening move of a far larger and far more dangerous negotiation. So, who is actually in control here? And what happens when 10 days run out? Stay with us, because by the end of this video, the full shape of what is unfolding will come into focus. To understand why this ceasefire matters beyond Lebanon, you have to understand the position Iran has been operating from for the past several months. Tehran was not a passive observer to this agreement. It was, in every meaningful sense, the hidden architect of its conditions. Iranian Foreign Minister Syed Abbas Araghchi had stated this plainly in the days leading up to the deal. The United States must choose between a ceasefire in Lebanon or continued war through its Israeli ally. There would be no second round of U.S. Iran nuclear negotiations, no diplomatic off-ramp for sanctions relief, unless the truce covered Lebanese territory. This was not a request, it was a demand, delivered through back channels, and Washington ultimately accepted the framework. This is where things connect in a way that reshapes the entire picture. Hezbollah is not simply a Lebanese militant group. It is Iran's most capable regional proxy, its forward deterrent, and its primary instrument of pressure against Israel. When Iran insisted that Lebanon be included in any ceasefire arrangement, it was not acting out of humanitarian concern for Beirut. It was protecting a strategic asset, and simultaneously testing how far the Trump administration was willing to go to bring Tehran back to the negotiating table. The answer, it turns out, was quite far. The Lebanon truce and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz are not two separate events. They are two outputs of the same calculation. Iran signaling that it can de-escalate, but only on its own terms. On the morning of April 17th, 2026, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social with the kind of declarative confidence that has come to define his foreign policy communication. He announced that the United States had effectively banned Israel from further bombing in Lebanon. His words were unambiguous. Enough is enough. It was a remarkable statement, a sitting American president publicly restraining the military actions of its closest Middle Eastern ally, and doing so not through quiet diplomatic pressure, but through a social media post visible to the entire world. This was not happening in isolation. Trump simultaneously framed the Lebanon ceasefire as his 10th solved conflict, writing that it had been his honor to solve 9 wars across the world, and this will be my 10th, so let's get it done. The political branding was immediate and deliberate. The White House published the announcement. The international press picked it up within minutes. But scrutiny followed just as fast. Critics, including analysts at The Independent and The Daily Beast, pointed out that several of the conflict's Trump counts among his solved wars remain active or unresolved. The ceasefire itself is 10 days long. Hezbollah has not disarmed. Israeli troops remain inside Lebanese territory. And the deeper structural questions, Iran's nuclear program, Hezbollah's weapons, the future of southern Lebanon, have not been touched. At the same time, the optics cannot be dismissed. Iran welcomed the deal. The UN and the EU welcomed the deal. Lebanese civilians began returning home. Oil markets stabilized. For a White House navigating simultaneous trade tensions and a fragile domestic economy, a foreign policy win, however provisional, carries enormous political value. When a ceasefire is announced, the first question diplomats ask is not whether the leader signed it. It is whether the fighters on the ground will honor it. And in southern Lebanon, on April 17, 2026, that question had no clean answer. The terms of the agreement place a specific and enormous burden on the Lebanese government. Beirut security forces were designated as the sole legitimate defense authority in the country. They were required to take active steps to prevent Hezbollah and all other non-state armed groups from launching any attacks against Israel. On paper, this represented a significant assertion of Lebanese state sovereignty. In practice, it described a government being asked to police an organization that in many parts of the country operates with more authority, more weaponry, and more popular support than the state itself. Hezbollah's position made the fragility explicit. The group confirmed the ceasefire would take effect, but it did not formally agree to the terms. Its public statement was pointed. Its finger is on the trigger. This is not the language of a party that has accepted defeat. It is the language of a party that has accepted a pause. Elsewhere, Israel's posture was equally telling. Prime Minister Netanyahu confirmed that Israeli troops would remain deployed inside southern Lebanon, maintaining a 10-kilometer security zone that Al Jazeera reported encompasses 55 villages. This was not a withdrawal, this was a repositioning. Israel has effectively shifted its strategic objective from the immediate disarmament of Hezbollah, which analysts at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies noted as early as April 3rd was no longer feasible, to the reestablishment of a long-term southern Lebanon security buffer reminiscent of the occupation zone Israel maintained until the year 2000. This is where the ceasefire's internal contradictions become impossible to ignore. Lebanon is being asked to disarm a force it cannot control. Israel is maintaining a presence Lebanon has not consented to, and the clock is ticking. At some point on April 17, 2026, Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi made an announcement that moved financial markets faster than almost any diplomatic statement in recent memory. The Strait of Hormuz, he declared, was completely open. Oil prices fell sharply, stock markets climbed, and for a brief moment, the economic anxiety that had gripped energy traders for weeks appeared to lift. To understand why those four words carried such weight, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually represents. It is a narrow waterway, at its most constricted point, barely 33 kilometers wide, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the broader global shipping lanes beyond. Through it passes roughly 20% of the world's traded oil, along with significant volumes of liquefied natural gas from Qatar and the UAE. It is, by any measure, the single most consequential choke point in the global energy system. And Iran sits on its northern shore. The Times of India reported that the first Iranian oil shipments had begun exiting the Gulf since a U.S. naval blockade had been imposed, a detail that reframes the ceasefire announcement entirely. This was not merely a humanitarian pause in a regional conflict. It was the unlocking of an economic artery that the United States had been squeezing as a pressure instrument against Tehran. Iran's declaration that Hormuz was open was simultaneously a de-escalatory gesture and a demonstration of restored leverage, a signal that Tehran retained the ability to close it again. This is where things connect to the broader negotiating dynamic. The Strait is Iran's ultimate economic weapon, one it has never fully deployed, precisely because deploying it would invite a response that even Tehran cannot absorb. But the threat of closure is itself a form of power. By publicly declaring it open, Iran was not surrendering that power. It was displaying it, reminding Washington, Riyadh, and the global energy markets exactly what remains at stake if diplomacy fails. There is a detail buried in the coverage of this ceasefire that deserves far more attention than it has received. The diplomatic channel that produced this agreement represents the first meaningful bilateral talks between the United States and Lebanon since 1983. That is not a typo. 43 years of near total diplomatic estrangement, punctuated by war, assassination, occupation, and proxy conflict, separated the last serious bilateral engagement from the conversations Secretary of State Marco Rubio facilitated in April 2026. To appreciate the weight of that gap, consider what 1983 meant in this context. It was the year a suicide bomber killed 241 American servicemen at the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, an attack for which Hezbollah's predecessor organization is widely held responsible. It was the moment the United States effectively withdrew from direct Lebanese engagement and began operating through proxies, partners, and periodic aerial interventions instead. The wound never fully healed, and for 4 decades, Washington and Beirut maintained the diplomatic equivalent of a cold shoulder. What Rubio achieved, and what the Trump administration is now claiming credit for, is the reopening of that channel. Lebanon's Prime Minister, Nawaf Salam, who took office earlier this year, leading a government explicitly committed to asserting state sovereignty over Hezbollah, was a critical counterpart. CBC reported that Lebanese officials expressed a desire to move toward direct talks with Israel, a development that, if it materializes, would be seismic in its own right. At the same time, the ceasefire terms allow for extension by mutual agreement, and the United States is already seeking to arrange a second round of talks. The architecture being assembled here is not simply a 10-day pause. It is, at minimum, the scaffolding for something larger, though whether that scaffolding holds depends almost entirely on variables that no diplomat in Washington can control. Every serious analyst covering this ceasefire arrives at the same wall. The agreement can pause the fighting. It can reopen shipping lanes. It can allow displaced Lebanese civilians to return to what Reuters described as unlivable areas. It can generate positive headlines and moving market charts. But it cannot answer the one question upon which the entire long-term architecture depends. What happens to Hezbollah's weapons? This is not a new problem. It is, in fact, one of the oldest and most intractable problems in Middle Eastern geopolitics. United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701, passed in 2006 following the last major Israel-Hezbollah war, called for the disarmament of all armed groups in Lebanon south of the Litani River. Nearly 2 decades later, that resolution remains unimplemented. Hezbollah not only retained its weapons, it expanded them dramatically, building one of the most sophisticated non-state military arsenals in history, with an estimated stockpile of over 100,000 rockets and missiles at its peak. Israel entered this latest conflict with disarmament as a stated goal. But analysts at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies noted as early as April 3rd that Israeli military objectives had already shifted, away from immediate disarmament and toward the reestablishment of a southern Lebanon security zone. This is a significant concession, even if it was never publicly framed as one. It means Israel has tacitly acknowledged that Hezbollah cannot be disarmed by force within any politically acceptable time frame. Meanwhile, the BBC reported that Lebanon seeks peace, but Hezbollah needs to be convinced first. That framing is precise and revealing. The Lebanese state and Hezbollah are not the same entity. The government in Beirut can sign agreements. It cannot compel Hezbollah to honor them. And Hezbollah, for its part, has never indicated any willingness to surrender the weapons that define its political and military identity. Its finger on the trigger statement was not posturing. It was a policy position. This is where the ceasefire's deepest fault line runs. not between Israel and Lebanon, but between the Lebanese state and the armed group operating within it that answers not to Beirut, but to Tehran. 10 days. That is what the world has been given. Not a peace agreement, not a framework treaty, not even a formal ceasefire in the traditional sense, since one of the principal armed parties has not signed it. What exists as of April 17th, 2026, is a fragile, provisional, deeply contested pause in a conflict that has been building for decades. And packed inside that pause is arguably the most consequential diplomatic negotiation the Middle East has seen in a generation. Consider what is now simultaneously in motion. The United States and Iran are edging toward a second round of nuclear talks. Talks that Tehran conditioned explicitly on the Lebanon truce. Israel is maintaining troops inside a sovereign neighboring country while claiming the moral and legal high ground of a ceasefire. Hezbollah is watching, armed and uncommitted. The Lebanese government is being asked to perform a function, controlling Hezbollah, that it has never been capable of performing. And Donald Trump is telling the world he has solved his 10th war, while the architects of that war are still holding their weapons. This is where the future outlook becomes both clarifying and sobering. If the 10 days hold and talks extend, the world may be witnessing the early architecture of a genuine regional realignment, one in which Iran trades proxy aggression for sanctions relief, Israel trades military dominance for security guarantees, and Lebanon finally begins the painful process of becoming a fully sovereign state. That outcome is possible. It is not probable. The more likely near-term scenario is a fragile extension of the truce, continued disagreement over Hezbollah's status, and a slow return to the underlying tensions that produced this conflict. The Strait of Hormuz will remain nominally open. Israeli troops will remain in southern Lebanon. And the fundamental question, whether Hezbollah can be separated from its weapons without a war that nobody wants to fight, will remain unanswered. What this moment has proven, without question, is that the architecture of the Middle East is shifting. The United States is engaging directly with Lebanon for the first time in 43 years. Iran is signaling, however cautiously, a willingness to negotiate. And the old assumption that this region's conflicts are permanent and unsolvable has been at least temporarily suspended. 10 days is not peace, but it may be the beginning of the conversation that makes peace conceivable. If you want to understand what comes next, subscribe, because this story is not finished. It has barely begun.